Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching me in today's new video, the top 6 most asked vintage clothing myths. As you can tell, it is a catchy title. Writing a winning title is obviously a skill I possess. So as it says on the tin and in the title, let's get straight down to it and discuss the 6 most asked vintage clothing myth questions. Okay, so number 1, vintage inspired clothing is exactly the same as vintage clothing. This is a myth. Vintage inspired clothing says what it is on the tin. It's inspired by vintage clothing, so it's inspired by usually a particular decade, something that you probably would have seen on Facebook, as it's always on my feed, are those stereotypical 1950s rockabilly, usually got some sort of cherry print on there or anchors, halter neck, sweetheart neckline, dresses which come up to the knee and flare out. Now that is vintage inspired clothing. Obviously you get different decades, but the 50s does seem to be a particularly popular era for vintage inspired clothing to not copy, but like uses their inspiration, especially those dresses, which is not 50s clothing at all. It's a real almost costume like part of the 50s, and it's a very small sort of demographic that was. So vintage inspired clothing is not vintage clothing, it is modern day clothing inspired by vintage clothing. Number 2, yuck, didn't someone die in those clothes? Now, you may think that I'm crazy for even bringing this up, but I have actually been asked this multiple times, and the simple answer is no, they didn't. Just because something old doesn't mean someone's died in it. You know, that is not vintage clothing at all. I really don't know what else to say on that apart from no. Just no. Okay, should we move on? Okay. Number 3. All vintage clothing is tiny. Not many people have a 24-inch waist. Now, okay, this is an interesting topic because, you know, vintage clothing is smaller than modern day sizes as the time has passed. In general, people have got bigger. I myself, I'm 6'1", so I'm exceptionally tall for a woman. But I actually find vintage clothing fits me better than modern day equivalents. Yes, vintage clothing is the sizing is technically smaller, so I like to say a rule of thumb. Obviously this does vary depending on what decade it is. Generally the older it is, the smaller it is going to be. So if you are a UK 10 now, which is a 28-inch waist, then the modern day equivalent size is probably a 14, which is crazy to think that because, you know, it is a big difference. But if you are a bigger size, 12, 14, 16, you can get vintage clothing to fit you. You will be surprised actually what is out there. So don't be put off with the fact that you think maybe you won't be able to find anything that fits you. I think, you know, you should just give it a go. You will be surprised. I have found lots of dresses recently in bigger sizes, so it's always good to have a look and give it a go yourself. Next, vintage clothing is hard to look after. Now this is not true as well. So this top here, this is like a satin embroidered, obviously vintage top. If I was to buy a modern day equivalent of this top, I would still have to hand wash it, which is exactly the same as what I would do with this top now being vintage. Now hand washing isn't hard, you know, you can still use the same liquid soaps. It's easier to use liquid soaps than powder because obviously it just mixes in with the water easily. And I like to sort of leave all my hand washing so I get like a bit of a load going, and then once I'm in the flow I then hand wash it all together, rinse it all out. It doesn't take very long at all, like a couple of minutes per piece probably. And then I still spin it in my washing machine, which is perfectly fine to do, and then I will hang it flat. Now when I say hang it flat, I mean, you know, over the door with like a towel on top of the door, and then put your piece of clothing on top of it. This is just going to help you prevent any like lines appearing in delicate fabrics and like heavy knitwear. It's good to do that. Please never drip dry your heavy knitwear on the hanger. It makes me so sad because you're going to get coat hanger marks. Not nice. And they stay until you wash them again, so you'll be really sad because it takes a while for them to dry in this season that we're in. So vintage clothing isn't harder to look after, or in comparison, sorry, to modern day clothing. It really is, you know, just taking the time to look after the pieces that you would do with modern day equivalents anyway. And you know, my mum always said, See Olive's ears? If you look after your things, they last a lifetime. And I do believe her, they do. All vintage clothing is expensive. Again, this is not true. Just like modern day clothing, there is different levels, isn't there? So, you know, if you're going to go and shop in Chanel, everything, that's expensive. The same with vintage clothing. If you only want to buy like vintage Chanel pieces, again, it's expensive, sometimes even more expensive than like if you used to buy something new from Chanel, because it's maybe one of a kind, it's really rare, has some sort of historical history behind it. So vintage clothing isn't expensive, and there's different levels of everything in life, isn't there? So you also, like, if you know where to shop, then you can get yourself a real bargain if you know what you're looking for, kind of thing. And with the vintage clothing, it really is about experience. So the more that you go out and look for something, the more that you are likely to find it. So vintage clothing isn't expensive, and actually I actually find personally that it can be cheaper than like modern day equivalents. So if you was to buy a beautiful like flared sleeve blouse, for example, in silk vintage, it may be between like £40 and £45. It's going to be wonderful quality because it's made from silk. It's already lasted like at least 20 years, which is the definition of vintage clothing. It has to be at least 20 years or older. If it goes from 1910 lower, so down into the 1800s, then that's classed as antique. Then about £40 to £45. If you want to buy something similar with the same quality of fabric on the high street, you could look at paying more. And you know, it's not unique, it's not one of a kind. So it's not expensive. It really is about, you know, finding the pieces that suit your budget and style. And like with everything in life, there's always a different levels, isn't there? Vintage and costumes are the same. No. Does I look like I'm wearing a costume? I don't think so. So like, you know, like going back to that sort of stereotypical 1950s rockabilly look, that's very costume-like, isn't it? You could sort of almost see it in one of those like American style 50s cafes with roller skates on. That's more costume. And other like, you know, Victorian sort of style outfits. Vintage clothing is very wearable. Fashion cycles tend to go around in a 30-year cycle. So like the 70s is always popular, isn't it? Like long boho dresses. This year we've had like the flare trousers come back in, and like all the embroidered boho, shearling, Afghan coats, when I can say it. They are all inspired by true 70s clothing. So if you was actually to get original one, it's not going to look like costume, is it? So it's not the same. I think those are stereotypical stereotype of vintage, and vintage and costumes from very specific small parts of a decade. The 50s is the main one. I keep mentioning it because, you know, I just get hammered a lot with this 50s rockabilly look, and I'm sick of seeing the ad on Facebook if I'm honest. Is like a prime target for almost portraying the fact that vintage clothing can be a bit costumey, but it's not. So they are the 6 most asked vintage clothing myths. I hope you've enjoyed this brief but hopefully informative and even maybe fun little video that Olive and I have done for you today. I will be back again to do my vintage Christmas table video before Christmas, so you can see how that goes. Thank you so much for watching me. If you have enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, and as always, if you have any questions at all, please just comment below or send me a message on any of the social media, on any of my social media accounts. You see the link below to all of those, and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, and you know, if you did really like it, you could even subscribe. Bye!